Well, y'all, the problems do not end with this question of whether or not good Christians should marry. They continue. And so the next thing that Paul addresses after that is this question in 8 through 10 of whether or not Christians should eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols. And Paul says basically, well, we know that idols are nothing at all. And so if you eat sacrifice to idols, that's okay. But for the conscience of weaker Christians or people who are not yet Christians, maybe you should abstain if you know that it is meat sacrificed to idols. One thing that some commentators have suggested is that food that had previously been sacrificed to idols was cheaper in the market than food that had not been sacrificed to idols. And so there's a possibility here that we have honor and shame going on here as well. So the richer individuals were able perhaps to buy meat that had not been sacrificed to idols, while the poorer folks, if they got meat at all, might buy meat that had been sacrificed to idols. Paul goes on to talk about, I'm going to skip over Rights of the Apostle and Warnings from Israel's History and move on to chapter 11. In chapter 11, Paul talks about the worship service, and he has some instructions that are fairly interesting. One of the primary questions that comes across is whether or not women ought to wear some kind of a head covering during the church service. Now, Longenecker and Still gave you their take on this whole thing, and I'm going to do my best to give you mine. So he starts off in 11:2, and he says, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings, just as I pass them on to you. Now, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And so he creates a kind of hierarchy here in which he says, or at least what seems to be a hierarchy, but may not actually be one, where he says on top is God, if this is a hierarchy. The head of Christ is God, so God here, then Christ, then man, then woman. And the Greek word that he uses here is kephale, which can either mean head or leader. I don't know which he's doing here, but he's going to kind of, if he means leader, he's going to switch back and forth a little bit as he goes on. And he says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. So now he's talking about this kind of head. And every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, just as though her head were shaved. So still talking about this head. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. And if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or shaved off, she should cover her head. So he's kind of reasoning about female hairdos and stuff. Interesting. And then he goes on and he says, man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. And I don't know what he means by that. Probably somebody should study that verse in a commentary and get back to me. But it is interesting to me that he says that man is the image and glory of God, and woman is the glory of man. I wonder if he's appealing to that second creation account in Genesis chapter 2, where woman is taken from man. I don't know. But the creation account in Genesis chapter 1 says that both male and female are created in the image of God, a word that he uses here. And so I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. And then he says in verse 8, for man did not come from woman, but woman from man. So there we go, that creation account. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. For this reason, and because of the angels, I have no idea what he means there. For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head, because she was taken from man, and because she was made for man. So she needs a sign of authority on her head, or is he talking about a leader? So on the man, I don't know. He goes on from here to say, in the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man. So now he's kind of shifted. He's been talking about whether or not people should wear head coverings, and now he kind of shifts gears and he says, in the Lord, so as a part of this new community of faith, however, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. So he's kind of leveling the playing field here. He just said that woman was taken from man. And now he's like, but you know what else? Men are taken from women. And I actually know this to be true because I have had a son. And so in that case, man, my son, was taken from woman, me, and my womb. So I think that's the argument that he's making here. But he says, everything comes from God. And so he's kind of woven his way around here. He's been talking about, okay, God, Christ, man, woman, if it is in fact a hierarchy, which I'm not sure that it is. And then he's talked about how woman came from man and how man comes from woman. And so he's kind of talked himself into a circle. And then he goes, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with their head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach us that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him, but if a woman has long hair, it's her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So he finishes off here, and he says, basically, he says, judge for yourselves. So I don't know, you guys don't think that women need to wear a head covering? Well, let's talk about it further. He says, if anybody wants to be contentious about this, I just want you to know that all of our churches do it this way. Women, when they prophesy and when they pray, wear a head covering. Men don't. That's just the way it is. Women have long hair, men have short hair. That's just the way it is. And these things have been essentialized in our history. Some of us are old enough to remember when it was just absolutely appalling for a man to have long hair. And you certainly were not a Christian if you were a man with long hair. And any Christian institution required that men wear short hair and women wear long. And so this whole passage has been essentialized in a couple of different ways. One of the things that I think is interesting, though, is that Paul starts out with a hierarchy and then moves to the interrelatedness and the interdependence of men and women. So just as woman came from man, so man comes from woman, and we're connected to one another. And notably, he is doing this kind of womb theology again that we've seen him do before. So, yeah. I don't know what he's getting after here. Lots of people would say that what he's getting after, of course, is that man is head of woman and women need to wear head coverings, and that's just also perfectly clear. I'm not actually sure that it is perfectly clear, because it is heresy to say that Christ is subordinate to God. That's one of those councils, like the Council of Nicaea, decided that or something. So Paul couldn't possibly be teaching heresy, or could he? And I don't know. So I don't know if what he has in mind here is a hierarchy or not. And I don't, oh, this is the one thing that really confuses me, though, is when he says that we know that women need to cover their heads, to have a sign of authority on their heads, because of the angels. I don't know what he means there. Why would I need to wear a hat to church? Because of the angels. Are there angels there as I'm worshiping? Maybe there are. What will a head covering or a hat do to help with that? I'm not exactly sure, but I wonder if he is thinking that perhaps the angels want to have sex with the women. And if the women do not cover their heads, then the angels will be too tempted. I don't know for certain, but in my big old red New Oxford Annotated Bible, it gives me a little footnote to look back at Genesis chapter 6, in which angels did come to earth and have sex with women. And so maybe that's a danger that Paul is concerned about. I don't know. Might have you look into that one too. That one's a pretty weird one. He moves on from there to talk about the Lord's Supper. And what has been going on in the Corinthian church is that the rich people have been showing up for the Lord's Supper first. And at this time, it was like a love feast. So there would be like tons of food. So the rich people are showing up first and eating all of the food. And the poor people are showing up later because they like have jobs and they have to work like maybe the second shift. They're showing up later. There's no food left. Paul says that is absolutely not okay. In verse 33, he says, "So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, you need to wait for each other and quit having all the rich people eat food first. If anyone is hungry, he should eat at home so that when you meet together, it may not result in judgment. And when I come, I will give you further direction." So stop eating all the food. If you're that hungry, eat before you come to the feast, which is a good rule of thumb. If you don't know when the meal is going to begin, anytime you're going somewhere, have a snack first. Okay, he goes on to talk about spiritual gifts, and he calls for unity in this very famous passage where he says in 12:21, talking about spiritual gifts, but using the analogy of the body, he says, "The eye cannot say to the hand, 'I don't need you,' and the head cannot say to the feet, 'I don't need you.' On the contrary, those parts of the body which seem to be weaker are indispensable." And so we all need each other. So stop trying to gain honor for yourself over above other people. And that happens in 12 through 14. And then 1 Corinthians 13, your BFF passage, is all about love and how he starts it with, "Now let me show you the most excellent way," which I think is fabulous, and goes on from there to talk about how love is the hallmark characteristic of the believer. And that is the sort of thing that will last. Not any of these banquets or food items or court proceedings. None of that lasts. Instead, it is love that never fails and is eternal. Then he goes on from there to talk about the different the different gifts again. And it seems that what has been going on is that some of the people in the church have the gift of tongues. And so they are trying to gain honor for themselves by speaking in tongues. And Paul's like, no, you can't do it that way. And it needs to be beneficial for the whole congregation. So again, we've got these people that are just trying to like build themselves up. It kind of sounds like the Wild West, like just a wildling of a church. And finally, the final thing that he goes on to talk about is the resurrection of the dead. Apparently, some teachers have come through and they have said, oh, Christ wasn't actually raised. And then Paul says, are you kidding me? That is the most essential thing, because if Christ has not been raised, then sin and death have not been defeated. And that is where our hope lies, in the defeat of sin and death. He says of those things that because Christ has been raised, we too can expect to be raised. He says in 5:51, listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. This is again the apocalyptic worldview. The trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then let the saying that is written come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, he has given us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And then he tells them to behave. So in large part, that is how the book of 1 Corinthians goes. There's a lot of trouble in Corinth when Paul writes to them. He's received a message from Chloe's people. He's received a letter from the Corinthians. And so he knows that things are not going smoothly. um, and that people are vying for authority and power that they ought not be vying for. They're trying to get honor and shame others. And he says that has no part in the kingdom of God. All right, when we get back together, we will talk about 2 Corinthians.